Okay, you finished carving your block and now you're ready to print. The first part is always getting your supplies together. So the first thing you'll need is your inking surface. A piece of plexiglass works beautifully for this. You could also use any non-absorbent surface. So a dinner plate would work, a piece of glass as long as it's flat, even a styrofoam plate or a styrofoam meat tray. That's clean, of course. Your wooden spoon, your brayer, and your printing ink. You're going to need your good printmaking paper. And so for this demo, my printmaking paper is a Japanese paper referred to as kozo, so it's a little bit yellowish. Then you'll also need a backer paper. You'll use this in printing, and it can be any paper as long as it's clean. I'm just using standard copy paper. Anything of that nature will work. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is on my inking surface, I'm going to squeeze out just a little bit of ink. Emphasis here on just a little bit. This ink is water-based and it will dry quickly, so don't waste it. Once you have the ink out on your inking surface, use a palette knife or a plastic knife, something of that nature, just to warm the ink up. This is a common practice in all printmaking. It makes the ink more pliable and easier to work with. Once the ink is pliable and ready to go, you're ready to lay out your ink. So the first thing I do is take the knife and draw what's called a bead. That is about the same size as the roller. And then I start rolling the ink out. Notice how when I pull back, I let the brayer roll. So that way I'm not hitting the same surface of the brayer over and over again. I'm also keeping the ink compact in one surface. So a couple more pointers about ink. That's my bead, it's the same size as my brayer, and I'm going to start rolling it out. When I'm doing this, I'm actually listening to the sound of the ink. That's referred to as the kiss. So you want it to sound velvety and smooth. It shouldn't have too great of a texture. It shouldn't look too much like orange peel, but it should look a little bit more like velvet. All right, now with ink on the brayer, I'm ready to ink my block. So I kind of become very methodical here in doing this, and I'll go up and down in one direction and then left and right in another direction. And I will also periodically recharge my brayer and come back. What I'm looking for is the same kind of velvety surface on my block as I have on the ink slab. I don't want too much ink, that will cause fill in and I'll lose the detail areas. Okay, with ink on the block, I'm ready to print. The first thing that I do is slowly and carefully drop my printing paper down. I also then slightly gently smooth it out with my fingers. Then from there, I'll take my buffer paper and lay that on top, and then I'll grab my spoon. I use the buffer paper so when I'm printing, I don't mar or rip the good paper printing surface, and then I just go back and forth. Alright, so then I'll continue printing for several moments. The goal here is to make sure that you cover and print off the entire surface of the block. So make sure you get all around to every corners as well as hitting the middle. You'll find your own momentum and way of going about doing this, so just take your time, there is no rush. Then when you're ready, you can gently lift back a corner, holding down the paper with your other hand, and check your progress. Now the key here is just to check a little bit at the time, lest you get things off register and you end up with a poor print. Okay, now that I've peeked and continue printing, I'm ready to actually pull the impression. And this is the phrase we use for actually taking the print away from the block. So you're pulling the paper away. Make sure you're careful that you don't crease or tear the paper as you do this. If the paper starts to stick in one direction, gently lift up from the other. Okay, so here you go. Here is my first impression and the inked block. Now at this point, I'm all ready to make some decisions, to observe and decide whether I want to continue carving the block or call it good. And I've decided as I look at the print that the flower on the right actually doesn't have enough tonal variation, and I'm going to go back in and carve the block. So I'm actually going to leave the ink on the block for doing this. So again, I can see exactly where I carve away. The acrylic will dry pretty quickly, so it might get a little on your hand, but not a lot. And I just jump right into making the changes to open up a few more areas on the block before I'll print it again. Okay, now that I've finished carving, I'm ready to print again. So it's all going to be the same as before. I made sure my block was clean. I got my bead of ink ready to go, my slab of ink, and I'm just going to start inking away. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm going to check and make sure that my ink and block stay clean. You'll notice that occasionally I'm going to stop and flick away little crumbs of linoleums or hairs, anything like that that get in the way. This debris, usually it's crumbs of linoleum, will cause a phenomenon in a print called a hickey. And no, I did not make that word up. It's a kind of a telltale sign. So as you're working, keep an eye on your ink slab and your block to make sure you don't have any of those crumbs on there. Also, again, make sure you kind of seamlessly put ink things up, left and right, up and down. Put your printing paper down in place, gently soothe it down with your hand so it stays put. Once the paper is down, add your buffer paper, grab your spoon, and you're ready to print. Again, remember the goals here. You want to make sure you get pressure on the entire surface of the block. So find your rhythm and routine to make this happen. And remember, the cover sheet can be reused, but once it gets too messy, just recycle it. Okay, again, as I'm printing, I'm going to get to that point where I feel like I've covered the entire surface, and I'll take a peek. And that's always fine to do. I'll just pull the cover paper back. Notice my non-dominant hand makes sure the paper stays in place, and I pull back just a little bit to see, oh, is this good? And I think so. Or maybe not. Just hit it a little bit more. I want to make sure all the areas are nice and rich and black. Okay, so now I'm ready to pull the impression. This time though, notice how the paper starts to stick. I don't want to tear the paper or ding it too much, so I'll go from the other direction and gently lift it off out of the way. Okay, here you go, and you can look at both impressions, the first and the second. And you can really see how I opened up that flower to the right and how we start to get more tonal variety than we previously had. These are referred to as state proofs, and artists will do this often. Print, observe, carve, and then repeat as many times as necessary to get the image that they want. Totally fine to do. All right, so we need to talk about cleaning up. We're working with water-based ink, which makes life really easy. The only problem is you don't want to leave your ink on your brayer for long. So as I did, I printed and went back to carving. I had to stop in between to clean the ink off the brayer. I just simply took it to my sink and used cold water. Cold water is important here to rinse it off, and if necessary, a little bit of dishwashing detergent. Same process for cleaning my inking service and my palette knife. I just took them to my kitchen sink, used cold water. You never want to use warm water, especially on brushes or brayers, because it can actually make the ink cure up and then it won't come off. So cold water and a little bit of dishwashing soap and or friction should take this right off of your inking surface, brayers, and palette knives. So now, here's the beauty of this process. I can continue working. I could make more changes to my block and print it again, or I could just jump into pulling an edition that is multiple prints from the same block. We'll discuss that more soon.